more than 500 women. Over 2 decades of abuse. At least 37,000 images of child sexual exploitation. Nearly $900 million paid in settlements. These numbers do not describe a war zone or a criminal syndicate. They describe one of the most respected athletic institutions in the United States. For years, the U.S. women's gymnastics program stood as a symbol of national pride. Olympic gold medals, world championship titles. Young athletes celebrated as heroes before they reached adulthood. Parents trusted the system with their children. Sponsors invested millions. Fans believed in excellence, discipline, and care. Behind that image, a different reality existed. According to court records and sworn testimony, a single team doctor, Larry Nassar, sexually abused hundreds of girls and young women under the guise of medical treatment. The abuse began as early as the mid-1990s and continued for more than 20 years. Many of the victims were children when it started. Some were as young as 12. Some were Olympic champions. Others never reached elite competition, but carried the trauma just as deeply. Statistically, large-scale abuse cases often reveal failures at multiple levels. In this case, the breakdown was not accidental. Reports of misconduct were made repeatedly. Complaints were filed. Warnings were raised. Yet again and again, those warnings were ignored, minimized, or actively concealed. Institutions tasked with protecting athletes chose silence. Reputation mattered more than safety. Medals mattered more than children. These horrifying stories are more than just cold headlines on the front page. They are records of trust betrayed at an institutional level. If you want to follow each file as it unfolds, subscribe now. Because when systems fail, the truth does not disappear. It waits. In 2016, as the world focused on the Rio Olympic Games, a newspaper in Indiana published an article that would shatter American sports. The Indianapolis Star revealed that sexual abuse within U.S. gymnastics was not isolated. It was widespread, and it had been allowed to continue for years. Within days, survivors began coming forward. What started as a single accusation became an avalanche of testimony. Larry Nassar was not an obscure figure. He was the national team doctor, a respected physician, a university professor. He attended 4 Olympic Games. He received awards, praise, and public recognition. Coaches trusted him. Parents trusted him. Athletes were taught to trust him without question. That trust was systematically exploited. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was not simply the story of one predator. It was the story of a system that failed at every checkpoint. Universities failed to report allegations. Governing bodies failed to act. Executives failed to intervene. In some cases, victims were asked to sign confidentiality agreements. In others, they were warned that speaking out could end their careers. By the time the criminal cases reached court, the scale of the damage was impossible to deny. More than 150 survivors stood before a judge to describe what had been done to them. Many spoke publicly for the first time. Some described abuse that occurred hundreds of times. Others described how no one believed them when they tried to tell the truth. This is not only a case about sexual abuse. It is a case about power, silence, and institutional protection. It is about how a system built to produce champions instead produced survivors. And it raises a question that extends far beyond gymnastics. When numbers grow this large, when warnings go unheard for decades, responsibility can no longer stop with one man. Long before Larry Nassar's name became synonymous with abuse, the environment that enabled him was already firmly in place. It was a system built on discipline, obedience, and results. In elite women's gymnastics, success often begins in childhood. Girls are identified young, trained relentlessly, and taught to follow authority without hesitation. That structure, designed to produce champions, also created the perfect conditions for silence. In the United States, competitive gymnastics is not merely a sport. It is a pipeline. Young athletes enter private clubs at 5 or 6 years old. By their early teens, many are training full-time, isolated from traditional schooling and social development. Their schedules are controlled by coaches. Their bodies are controlled by medical staff. Their futures depend on compliance. Within this environment, questioning authority is discouraged. Pain is normalized. Discomfort is reframed as weakness. Athletes are told that success requires sacrifice and that those who complain are replaceable. The power imbalance is profound. A single coach can determine whether a child advances or disappears from the system entirely. Larry Nassar entered this structure as a trusted figure. He was not a coach, but his authority was arguably greater. As the national team doctor, he controlled access to treatment, recovery, and competition readiness. He presented himself as calm, gentle, and deeply invested in athlete well-being. Parents were reassured by his credentials. Coaches deferred to his expertise. Athletes were instructed to obey. Nassar's abuse was disguised as medical care. He claimed that his invasive procedures were legitimate treatments for pain or injury. He used medical terminology. He insisted that his methods were misunderstood by others. In many cases, he performed these procedures without gloves, without proper explanation, and without consent. Yet within the culture of elite gymnastics, athletes were conditioned not to question. For minors, the situation was even more restrictive. Parents were often excluded from treatment rooms. Privacy was framed as professionalism. When athletes expressed discomfort, they were told that the pain was necessary, that they did not understand medicine, or that their reactions were normal. The confusion was deliberate. What makes this case especially disturbing is not only the duration of the abuse, but the number of opportunities institutions had to stop it. Complaints were made. As early as the late 1990s, athletes told coaches and administrators that something was wrong. Some reported Nassar's conduct directly to officials at USA Gymnastics. Others informed staff at Michigan State University, where Nassar also worked. In multiple instances, parents raised concerns. The response was consistent. The allegations were minimized, redirected, or quietly buried. Instead of contacting law enforcement, institutions conducted internal reviews. Instead of removing Nassar from athlete access, they allowed him to continue practicing. In some cases, he was permitted to resign quietly or change roles, avoiding scrutiny. The priority was not safety. It was damage control. At the organizational level, USA Gymnastics operated with limited external oversight. Its leadership held significant influence over athlete careers and Olympic selection. Reporting abuse meant risking retaliation. Athletes feared being labeled difficult. Parents feared their children would be cut from teams. Coaches feared losing funding or status. This was not accidental neglect. It was a pattern. When athletes attempted to speak up, they encountered disbelief. Nassar was respected. He had medals, awards, and institutional backing. The idea that such a figure could be a serial abuser was easier to dismiss than confront. In some cases, victims were encouraged to sign non-disclosure agreements. In others, they were advised to remain quiet for the good of the sport. The system rewarded silence and punished resistance. Michigan State University, where Nassar treated both athletes and non-athletes, also failed repeatedly. Reports of misconduct were handled internally. Investigations were slow, fragmented, and inconclusive. Nassar retained access to patients for years after concerns were raised. Each institutional failure reinforced the same message. Speaking out would not protect victims. It would isolate them. For many survivors, the abuse was compounded by the response to it. They were not only violated physically, but dismissed emotionally. Their credibility was questioned. Their motives were scrutinized. Some were told they misunderstood medical procedures. Others were told they were alone. They were not alone. By the time the truth emerged publicly, it became clear that the silence surrounding Larry Nassar was not the result of ignorance. It was the result of structure, a hierarchy that concentrated power, a culture that valued performance over protection, institutions that chose reputation over responsibility. This chapter of the story is not about one man's actions. It is about the system that made those actions possible and sustained them for more than 20 years. And as long as that system remained intact, the abuse continued. By the time Larry Nassar was finally arrested, the question was no longer whether warning signs existed. It was how many times those warnings had been consciously ignored. The first documented concerns about Nassar's conduct surfaced in the mid-1990s. At that time, he was already deeply embedded within the gymnastics system, treating young athletes at private clubs, national training camps, and through his position at Michigan State University. His reputation was carefully cultivated. He was described as knowledgeable, soft-spoken, and indispensable. That reputation became his shield. Several athletes later testified that they had reported inappropriate treatment while they were still minors. Some spoke to coaches. Others told trainers, administrators, or university staff. In multiple cases, parents raised questions after witnessing or hearing descriptions of Nassar's methods. The responses followed a familiar pattern. The complaints were reframed as misunderstandings. The athletes were told that Nassar's techniques were medically sound, and the matter was quietly closed. At USA Gymnastics, internal handling replaced accountability. Rather than notifying law enforcement, executives chose to manage allegations internally. Reports were routed through legal departments. Language was softened. Timelines were delayed. Each step created distance between the accusation and any real consequence. One of the most critical failures occurred in 2015, when USA Gymnastics was formally informed of sexual misconduct allegations involving Larry Nassar. Instead of contacting police immediately, the organization waited more than a year before taking action. During that time, Nassar continued to treat athletes. The delay was not accidental. According to investigative findings, leadership feared reputational damage during an Olympic cycle. Michigan State University demonstrated a similar pattern. Over the years, multiple complaints reached university officials. In some cases, internal investigations were opened, then quietly closed. Nassar was allowed to resign from certain roles while retaining others. He was reassigned rather than removed. Each administrative decision prioritized institutional protection over patient safety. The system also relied heavily on isolation. Young athletes often lacked the language to describe what was happening to them. When they tried, their accounts were filtered through adults with conflicting interests. Coaches depended on USA Gymnastics for funding and advancement. Universities depended on donors and prestige. No single actor wanted to be responsible for exposing a scandal of this magnitude. In this environment, Larry Nassar did not need to threaten his victims explicitly. The system itself applied pressure. Athletes understood that speaking out could end their careers. They had watched teammates disappear from competition after being labeled difficult. They had been taught that success required endurance, not protest. Some victims later described being asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. Others were discouraged from pursuing complaints outside institutional channels. In certain cases, parents were reassured that concerns had been investigated, even when no meaningful inquiry had taken place. The message was consistent. Trust the system. Do not escalate. Law enforcement failures compounded the damage. In 2015, an investigation conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation mishandled early reports from Olympic athletes. Agents failed to document statements accurately. They delayed action. They did not alert local authorities in a timely manner. This failure allowed Nassar's abuse to continue for more than a year after federal involvement began. The cumulative effect of these decisions was devastating. Each ignored warning validated the next. Each institutional silence reinforced Nassar's confidence. He continued abusing athletes, knowing that complaints led nowhere. The absence of consequences became proof of immunity. Public exposure finally arrived in 2016, not through internal reform, but through journalism. An investigation by the Indianapolis Star revealed a pattern of sexual abuse within gymnastics and a culture that enabled it. Once the story broke, the floodgates opened. Survivors who had been isolated for years realized they were not alone. What emerged was not a series of isolated mistakes, but a sustained failure across organizations. USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, the U.S. Olympic Committee, federal investigators. Each had access to information that should have triggered immediate intervention. None acted decisively. This chapter of the case makes one fact unavoidable. Larry Nassar did not succeed because he was invisible. He succeeded because he was protected. The warning signs were present. The reports were made. The opportunity to stop him existed repeatedly over 2 decades. Each time the system chose silence. And when silence is enforced at scale, abuse does not remain hidden. It multiplies. When the case against Larry Nassar finally reached the courtroom, it became something far larger than a criminal proceeding. It became a reckoning. By the time sentencing began in January 2018, Larry Nassar had already pleaded guilty to multiple counts of criminal sexual conduct. The legal outcome was no longer in question. What remained was the human record. And for the first time, the system that had silenced victims for decades was required to listen. More than 150 women and girls chose to speak. They stood one by one in a Michigan courtroom and described what Larry Nassar had done to them. Some were Olympic gold medalists. Others had never competed at the elite level. Some were teenagers. Others were adults who had carried the trauma for most of their lives. Their backgrounds differed, but their experiences followed the same pattern. They had trusted a doctor. They had been told the abuse was treatment. They had tried to report it, and they had been ignored. Rachel Den Hollander was the first to speak publicly, and her statement set the tone for everything that followed. She described being abused by Nassar as a teenager under the guise of medical care. She explained how authority, faith, and trust had been weaponized against her. Her testimony was precise, controlled, and devastating. It dismantled every remaining attempt to frame the abuse as misunderstanding. As survivor after survivor took the stand, the courtroom transformed. This was no longer about Larry Nassar. He sat silent, head down, reduced to a name spoken only in condemnation. The focus shifted entirely to those he had harmed. Olympic champion Ali Raisman addressed the court directly. She rejected apologies that came too late, and exposed the institutional failures that allowed Nassar to continue. She spoke not only for herself, but for teammates who had been told to stay quiet. Her words carried the weight of someone who had succeeded in the system and still been betrayed by it. Michaela Maroney described the psychological toll of abuse that occurred while she was training to represent her country. She spoke of fear, isolation, and the cost of silence. Simone Biles, Jordan Weber, Gabby Douglas, and others later echoed the same truth. Winning medals did not protect them. Status did not protect them. The system did not protect them. Some statements were calm. Others were raw with anger. Several were read by parents whose daughters were unable to speak. One father, whose daughter had been abused, described how the trauma ultimately contributed to his own suicide attempt. Another parent collapsed in court while recounting the impact on their family. What unified every testimony was clarity. The abuse was real. The harm was lasting. And the failures were systemic. Judge Rosemary Aquilina presided over the sentencing. Her role would become historic. Rather than limiting victim statements to a handful of speakers, she allowed every survivor who wished to speak the opportunity to do so. Over the course of several days, the courtroom became a space for collective truth-telling. When Aquilina finally addressed Larry Nassar, her words were direct and unequivocal. She rejected his attempts at remorse. She rejected the narrative of misunderstanding. And she rejected the idea that his crimes could ever be minimized. "You are no longer in control," she told him. In that moment, power shifted. For survivors who had been told for years that their voices did not matter, the courtroom became proof that silence was not permanent. The very institutions that had failed them were now forced to watch as the truth was spoken publicly, recorded permanently, and acknowledged by the legal system. The sentencing that followed was severe. Larry Nassar received sentences totaling decades in prison, effectively ensuring he would never be released. But for many survivors, the length of the sentence was not the point. What mattered was recognition, accountability, and the knowledge that future victims might be spared. Outside the courtroom, the impact was immediate. Public outrage intensified. Executives resigned. Investigations expanded. USA Gymnastics faced collapse. Michigan State University confronted lawsuits and leadership changes. The U.S. Olympic Committee was forced to respond. The survivors had done what institutions refused to do for years. They exposed the truth. This chapter of the story is not defined by Larry Nassar's downfall. It is defined by the moment victims reclaimed their agency. When silence broke. When power shifted. When a system built to suppress voices was overwhelmed by them. And with that shift, the final phase of the case began. When Larry Nassar was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the legal chapter of his crimes reached its end. The institutional reckoning, however, was only beginning. Nassar was sentenced to multiple consecutive prison terms that ensured he would never regain his freedom. He was later sentenced in federal court for possession of child sexual abuse material, adding years to an already irreversible punishment. From a legal standpoint, the verdict was final. From a moral standpoint, it exposed a far larger failure. In the months that followed, the organizations that had enabled Nassar faced consequences of their own. USA Gymnastics entered bankruptcy. Its leadership resigned under intense public pressure. Congressional hearings examined how complaints had been handled and why warnings had been ignored for so long. Michigan State University agreed to a settlement of approximately $500 million with survivors and implemented sweeping leadership changes. In total, institutions connected to the case paid nearly $880,000 USD in settlements. The numbers were staggering. But for many survivors, financial compensation was never the measure of justice. What mattered was acknowledgement, the recognition that the abuse was real, that it was systemic, and that it should never have been allowed to continue. The case also reshaped how the United States approaches athlete safety. New safeguarding policies were introduced. Mandatory reporting requirements were strengthened. The U.S. Center for Safe Sport was established to handle abuse allegations independently of sports organizations. While critics argue that reforms remain incomplete, the case permanently altered the conversation around power and protection in youth sports. Perhaps the most lasting impact lies in the shift of narrative. For decades, Larry Nassar was protected by authority and credibility. When he finally fell, it was not because institutions corrected themselves, but because survivors refused to remain silent. They spoke publicly, repeatedly, and collectively until silence became impossible to maintain. This story is often described as the downfall of a predator. That framing is incomplete. It is equally the story of a system that prioritized medals over minors, reputation over responsibility, and control over care. Nassar did not operate alone. He operated with permission, reinforced by layers of inaction. Today, his name is no longer associated with medical expertise or Olympic success. It is a warning, a reminder of what happens when trust is weaponized and accountability is deferred. For the survivors, the trauma does not end with sentencing. Healing is not linear. Justice does not erase memory. But what this case did provide was something long denied: a record, a voice, and a moment when power shifted permanently away from the abuser. The Larry Nassar scandal stands as one of the darkest chapters in American sports history. Not because it happened in secret, but because it happened in plain sight. And because so many chose not to see it. That is the legacy. And that is the lesson.